He was a millionaire CEO walking past a cold bus stop on Christmas Eve until he saw a little girl asleep on the bench, clutching a ragged doll. Her words were unanswerable him. What he did the next day would change all of their lives forever. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The night was cold enough that even the breath of the city seemed to shiver. Ethan Cole stepped out of the towering glass building that bore his name, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the pavement. He was exhausted, though no one looking at him would have guessed it. His tailored black suit was pristine, his silver tie perfectly knotted. His pine-sol friend was no fellow ability, conquered the world, even when his soul felt empty. The board meeting had dragged on far longer than it should have, an endless parade of numbers, strategies, and power plays. Ethan was a man who could command a room, who could reduce ambitious rivals to silence with a single word. And yet, as he walked through the dimly lit street just past midnight, his power meant nothing. All he wanted was solitude and a glass of aged scotch in his penthouse. But fate had other plans. At first, he didn't notice her. His mind was still caught up in the figures presented on the last quarterly report, the argument he'd crushed with one cutting remark, the empire that depended on his ruthless efficiency. He almost passed the bus stop without looking. It was a worn bench beneath a flickering light, hardly worthy of his notice. But then he heard it, soft, muffled words, like someone talking in their sleep. He stopped. There, curled up on the bench, was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7. Her hair was tangled, her coat far too thin for the bitter winter air. She clutched a ragged doll against her chest, as though it were the last piece of safety she had left in the world. Her lips trembled, not just from the cold, but from whatever dreams haunted her fragile sleep. For a long moment, Ethan just stood there, his hand tightening around the handle of his leather briefcase. His instincts told him to keep walking. She wasn't his responsibility. He had a company to run, investors to appease, and a reputation to uphold. But then, as if against his will, his eyes lingered on her small frame, on the way she curled into herself as though trying to disappear. And he remembered. He remembered being a boy, not much older than her, standing at a window in the dead of night, waiting for parents who never came home. He remembered the silence of a house where love had once lived but had been drowned out by greed, neglect, and abandonment. He remembered promising himself he would never be weak again, never be left behind, never be at the mercy of anyone. The little girl stirred, her lips moved, and a soft whisper escaped. "Marmee, don't go." The words struck him harder than any business rival ever had. He stepped closer before he could stop himself, his polished shoes crunching lightly against the thin layer of snow that dusted the pavement. Her eyes fluttered open. They were large and brown, glassy with fatigue but startlingly clear in the glow of the flickering light. She sat up quickly, clutching the doll tighter, as though afraid he might take it away. Ethan crouched down slowly, an unfamiliar gentleness in his voice. "Where's your home?" The girl blinked at him. For a moment he thought she might not answer. Then she whispered, her voice as fragile as her thin frame. "No home. Mommy went to heaven." Something in Ethan's chest twisted. He had heard tragic stories before. He had read them in the news, seen them in reports, but hearing it from her own lips, seeing the raw truth in her eyes, was different. This wasn't an article to skim or a statistic to file away. This was a child, alone in the freezing night, and she was looking at him as though he might be the only person left in the world who could care. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words had always been his weapon, his tool, his armor, but in that moment, they failed him. The girl hugged her doll tighter. "I just wanted something to eat." Ethan swallowed hard. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his wallet. He had more cash in there than she would likely see in her entire childhood. Without thinking, he pulled out a thick bundle of bills and held it out to her. "Here, this will help." Her eyes widened, but not with the gratitude he expected. Instead, she shook her head, her tangled hair falling across her face. "I don't want money," she whispered fiercely, surprising him. "I just want my mommy back." Ethan froze. His hand trembled slightly, the money still outstretched between them. He couldn't remember the last time someone had refused what he offered. In his world, money solved everything. But here, in front of this girl with nothing but a ragged doll and trembling shoulders, his wealth was worthless. He lowered the bills slowly. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quieter now. She said, after a long pause. He repeated softly, as though testing the sound of it. It was a small name, but somehow it felt heavier than the contracts he signed, heavier than the deals that built his empire. She yawned, her eyes drooping again. Exhaustion pulled at her, but she fought it, still clinging to the doll. Ethan stood, his chest tight. He looked down the street, saw the dark alleys and the shadows stretching out. He knew what could happen to a girl like her in a city like this. His instincts screamed at him to act, to take her somewhere safe. And yet, he hesitated. He had built walls around himself for years, walls so high and so strong that nothing could break through. Taking responsibility for this girl meant lowering those walls. It meant opening himself up to risk, to vulnerability, to emotions he had buried long ago. He looked back at Mia. Her small figure shivered on the bench, her doll clutched tightly. In the end, he did the one thing he always knew how to do. He reached for his wallet again. This time, he gently set the bills on the bench beside her. "For food," he said, almost gruffly, as though trying to mask the strange crack in his voice. Then, before he could change his mind, he turned and walked away. But every step he took felt heavier than the last. By the time he reached his sleek black car, guilt had wrapped itself around his throat like a noose. He climbed into the back seat, the driver shutting the door behind him. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, but all he could see was the little girl's face, the way she had whispered about her mother being in heaven. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt something he couldn't control. Regret. And as the car pulled away from the bus stop, one thought burned in his mind with relentless clarity. He had left her there, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was the greatest mistake of his life. The night should have ended when Ethan stepped into his car. He should have returned to his penthouse, poured himself a drink, and buried the memory of the girl beneath layers of business and routine. That was how he survived. By compartmentalizing, by shutting away anything that threatened to soften the steel he'd forged around his heart. But sleep did not come easily. He stood at his window hours later, looking out over the glittering skyline of the city he had helped shape. From this high, the streets looked like arteries of light, pulsing with life. But all he could see was one corner, one flickering street lamp, one small figure curled on a bench. The name replayed in his mind with every tick of the clock. He could still hear the tremor in her voice when she whispered about her mother. He could still see her clutching that ragged doll as if it were armor. And he could still feel the sting of her rejection when she refused his money. Money had always been the answer. It was the language he spoke, the currency of control. But tonight, it had failed him. And remembered her words, "I just want my mommy back." For a man like Ethan, who had built his empire on deals and power, there was no answer to that. There was no transaction to undo death, no negotiation to replace love. He had left her because he didn't know what else to do, and yet the guilt gnawed at him like a relentless tide, wearing down the walls he thought were unbreakable. By dawn, he hadn't slept. His tie was loosened, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He told himself he had too much work to linger on one child. He had meetings lined up, contracts to sign, an empire to oversee. But when he sat down at the long oak table in his study, the spreadsheets and proposals blurred. All he saw was her. Where is she now? The question rattled inside him until he slammed his fist onto the table. His assistant Michael appeared in the doorway moments later, startled. "Sir?" Ethan looked up, his jaw tight. He wanted to demand research on acquisitions, on rivals, on markets. But the words that left his lips surprised even him. "Last night, at the corner of 7th and Willow," he said, his voice clipped. "There was a girl, 7, maybe 8 years old. Find out if she's still there." Michael hesitated. "A girl, sir?" "Ethan snapped. "Sleeping at a bus stop. I left her there." His voice cracked with the admission, though he covered it quickly. "I need to know if she's—" Michael nodded, masking his surprise with professional efficiency. "Of course, sir. I'll send someone immediately." Ethan leaned back in his chair as Michael left, rubbing his temples. What was he doing? This wasn't his problem. He wasn't her guardian. He wasn't responsible. And yet, a small voice inside him, the one he had buried since his own childhood, whispered otherwise. "You walked away. You left her. That makes it your burden." The hours dragged. Every phone call he took, every meeting he sat through, blurred with distraction. When Michael returned, his expression was sober. "She wasn't there this morning," he reported carefully. "No child matching that description was found. The police received no reports." Ethan's chest tightened. "So she's just gone?" Michael hesitated, then added, "I checked nearby shelters. One worker said a girl and a doll were seen late last night, but they didn't stay. They vanished before morning." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The weight in his chest grew heavier. She was still out there, somewhere in the cold, drifting like he once had, with no safety and no certainty. That night, he returned to the same corner. The city hummed around him, cars rushing by, strangers brushing past, but the bench was empty. Only the flickering streetlight remained, casting its pale glow on a patch of snow. He stood there for a long time, staring at the place where she had been. In that silence, memories assaulted him. Memories of his own boyhood, the nights he had waited for parents who never came home, the coldness of a house filled with everything except love, the ache of being unseen, unheard, unwanted. He had vowed he would never feel powerless again, but here he was, a man with the world at his feet, unable to shake the image of a small girl and her whispered words. His phone buzzed, he ignored it. Instead, he whispered into the cold night, as though speaking to her. "I should have done more." The next morning, he found himself restless. Work felt hollow. Numbers meant nothing. Even the board members noticed his distraction. "Everything all right, Mr. Cole?" one of them asked, cautiously. He lied, of course. Fine. But he wasn't fine, because every decision he made felt tainted by that moment when he had walked away. He told himself she was just another face in a city full of sorrow, but deep down, he knew better. She wasn't just another child, she was a mirror. And mirrors couldn't be ignored. That night, he drove the city streets himself, something he hadn't done in years. He passed alleys, soup kitchens, and shelters. He scanned every face, searching for tangled hair, a ragged doll, large brown eyes. But Mia was nowhere to be found. When he finally returned home, dawn was breaking. He collapsed into his armchair, exhausted, but before he drifted into a fitful sleep, he made a silent vow. If he found her again, he wouldn't walk away. Not this time. Because no amount of money, no empire, no boardroom victory could erase the image of a little girl clutching a doll under the cold flickering light of a bus stop and the sound of her whisper, "Mommy went to heaven." And Ethan Cole, the man who had built walls too high for anyone to climb, realized that, for the first time in years, those walls had cracked. The morning after his restless night, Ethan Cole arrived at his office later than usual, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. The moment he stepped inside, his assistant, Michael, handed him the day's briefings, rattling off numbers and meetings, but Ethan barely listened. His mind was already elsewhere. Back at that flickering streetlight, back at the empty bench where a little girl should have been. "Find her?" Ethan said abruptly, cutting off Michael's rundown of quarterly projections. "Find her." Michael blinked. "Sir?" Then again, hope sinking. The hair on his forehead broke as 7 ignored him. 7, maybe 8. Brown hair carries a ragged doll. Her name's Mia. Michael hesitated only a second before nodding. "Understood. I'll contact local shelters and outreach programs." Hours dragged like days. Ethan buried himself in paperwork but found no focus. Meetings blurred into meaningless chatter. He checked his phone constantly, waiting for word. Every time the screen stayed blank, guilt gnawed deeper into his gut. He had abandoned her once. He would not let himself fail her again. By late afternoon, Michael returned with an update. "Sir, I believe we found her. A shelter downtown. She's there with an older sister, Isabella." Ethan was on his feet before Michael finished. "Take me." The drive felt endless, though the shelter wasn't far. Located in a crumbling part of the city, it was a world Ethan rarely saw. Graffiti on brick walls, cracked sidewalks, weary faces moving with hurried purpose. The car pulled up in front of a low building with peeling paint and a hand-painted sign that read, "Safe Haven Shelter." Inside, the air smelled faintly of soup and detergent. Children's laughter echoed down the hallway, but it was thin, fragile, like light struggling through fog. Volunteers moved briskly, offering blankets and smiles that didn't hide exhaustion. Then he saw her. Mia sat cross-legged on the floor near a stack of donated toys, still clutching her doll. She looked smaller in daylight, more fragile than he remembered. But when she laughed at something whispered by the young woman beside her, Ethan recognized strength in the sound. The young woman had Mia's same eyes, though older, shadowed with responsibility. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, strands falling loose around a face too young to look so tired. She was maybe 22, 23 at most, but there was a weight in her posture, shoulders squared, gaze sharp, that belonged to someone twice her age. Michael stepped forward to introduce Ethan, but Isabella rose to her feet before he could speak. Her chin lifted, protective, her hand resting lightly on Mia's shoulder. "Fear him," she said flatly. Ethan frowned. "Him?" "Medic. The man who left her on a bench, with cash stuffed in her pocket," Isabella said, her voice low but edged with fire. "She told me..." Ethan felt the sting of her accusation. "I didn't know what else to do. You don't get to explain," Isabella cut in. "You think money fixes everything? It doesn't. She's not a problem you can pay to go away. She's my sister." Mia looked up between them, confusion flickering across her face, but Isabella's hand tightened, anchoring her in place. Ethan opened his mouth, but for once, words didn't come easily. He had faced cutthroat executives, ruthless negotiators, hostile takeovers. Yet standing in front of this young woman, fierce in her defiance, he felt uncharacteristically ashamed. "I'm not here to buy her," he said finally, his voice lower. "I just want to help." "Help?" Isabella's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Where were you when we lost everything? When our parents died and I had to choose between school and raising her? When rent was overdue and I was working 2 jobs, barely able to keep her fed? You don't get to swoop in now, flash your wealth and call it help." Her words struck harder than any boardroom insult ever had. Ethan swallowed the instinct to defend himself. Instead, he forced himself to meet her gaze. "Purine," he admitted, "I wasn't there. But I saw her, and I can't forget it. I don't want to forget it. Please, let me try." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Isabella studied him with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through his polished exterior, weighing the truth of his words. She didn't answer immediately, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter but still guarded. "You convince itself, that's all. But understand this understandability isn't for sale. Neither is mine." Ethan nodded, relief mingling with something deeper. That evening, he stayed at the shelter longer than he had planned. He sat on a worn couch across from the sisters, observing the easy rhythm between them. Isabella corrected Mia's spelling on a homework sheet, patient despite her exhaustion. Mia leaned against her side, humming softly as she drew. The room was small, the furniture mismatched, but there was warmth here, warmth Ethan's mansion had never known. When he finally rose to leave, Isabella's eyes tracked him warily, but Mia whispered shyly, "Will you come back?" The question caught him off guard. For a long beat, Ethan only stared. Then he nodded. She said softly, "I'll come back." And, for the first time in years, Ethan Cole left a room not thinking about contracts, empires, or wealth, but about a girl with a ragged doll and the sister who carried the weight of the world on her young shoulders. Ethan returned 2 days later, surprising even himself. He told Michael it was only to ensure Mia was safe, but the truth was harder to admit. He wanted to see them again. The shelter director greeted him politely, though with curiosity. Wealthy men like Ethan didn't usually step into places like this twice. As he entered the common room, Mia's face lit up. She rushed over, doll in hand, tugging at his sleeve. "You came back," she said breathlessly. Something inside him, something he thought had died long ago, stirred. He knelt so he could meet her at eye level. "I told you I would, didn't I?" Her smile was radiant, innocent, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan felt the weight of his guilt lighten. Isabella approached slowly, her arms crossed. She didn't smile, but she didn't stop Mia from holding his hand either. "You're persistent," she remarked. "And keep my promises," Ethan replied evenly. "Promises are easy for people like you," Isabella said, her tone sharp. "It's keeping them that's hard." Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he glanced around the room, taking in the cracked walls, the thin blankets folded neatly on cots, the shelves of canned food stacked precariously. He thought of his own home, glowing, spotless, vast enough for 10 families, and felt a pang he couldn't quite name. "Can I see where you live?" he asked suddenly. Isabella blinked, clearly taken aback. "Why?" "Because I want to understand," Ethan said simply. For a long moment, Isabella studied him, suspicion warring with something else. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, but don't come expecting to play savior." That evening, Ethan followed the sisters to a small apartment above a laundromat. The stairwell smelled faintly of bleach and mildew, the paint peeling on the banister. Inside, the apartment was cramped. One bedroom, a tiny kitchenette, a living area barely big enough for the sagging couch and secondhand table. Yet everything was clean, carefully tended, as though Isabella's pride refused to let poverty dictate dignity. Mia proudly showed him her corner of the bedroom, where she kept her doll and a small collection of coloring books. Isabella hovered nearby, watching closely, her every gesture protective. Ethan's gaze lingered on the stack of bills piled neatly on the counter, the textbooks open on the table, and the exhaustion etched in Isabella's face. She was balancing survival and guardianship in a way few people ever could. Something shifted in him then, not pity, but a sharp, painful respect. "He ever rest?" he asked quietly. Isabella shrugged, as if the question were foolish. "Rest doesn't pay rent." He looked at her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking deep. That night, as Ethan drove home, the city lights blurred through the windshield. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of a burden he could not delegate, a responsibility he could not escape. Because now he knew their faces, their stories, their struggle. And Ethan Cole was not a man who ignored what he knew. Ethan Cole was not a man who made impulsive offers, but as he stood in the doorway of Isabella and Mia's cramped apartment, the words left his lips before logic could stop them. "You should stay at my estate," he said, his voice steady but carrying an urgency that surprised even him. "Just until winter ends. At least then Mia will be warm, and you won't have to keep fighting, alone." The silence that followed was heavy. Isabella blinked at him, stunned, then let out a sharp laugh that carried no humor. "Your estate," she repeated, her arms crossing tightly over her chest. "Do you have any idea how that sounds? You think we're some charity project you can swoop in and fix with your wealth." Ethan shook his head. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" she demanded, her tone rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like another rich man throwing around pity as if it were kindness." Before Ethan could answer, Mia tugged on his sleeve, her wide, brown eyes fixed on his face. "You mean it?" she asked softly. "We can come with you?" Isabella's jaw clenched, torn between instinctive refusal and the pleading in her sister's voice. She crouched to Mia's level. "Mia, we can't just move into a stranger's house." "It's not a stranger," Mia interrupted earnestly. "He came back, he promised." The words landed heavier than Ethan could have anticipated. She remembered, she trusted him, and despite Isabella's fierce resistance, Mia's tiny hand reached up, curling tightly around Ethan's fingers, as if she'd already made her choice. Isabella's shoulders sagged. She looked from Mia to Ethan, her gaze filled with a mixture of exhaustion and reluctant hope. "1 month," she said finally, "that's all. And if I see even one sign that this is about control, or pity were gone. Ethan nodded. Agreed. The following evening, his black sedan pulled up outside the shelter to collect them. The staff watched curiously as Isabella and Mia stepped out with only 2 small bags between them. Isabella's face was taut, her chin high, daring anyone to judge her. Mia, on the other hand, practically skipped to the car, her ragged doll clutched in one hand. When they arrived at Ethan's estate, the contrast was staggering. The mansion rose like a palace against the winter dusk, its tall windows glowing with warm light, snow dusting the manicured hedges along the driveway. Mia gasped aloud, her eyes wide as "Look like a castle," she whispered, pressing her nose to the car window. Ethan couldn't help the flicker of a smile. "It's just a house," he said quietly. But Isabella's sharp glance reminded him that for them, it was anything but just a house. Inside, staff lined the foyer, clearly summoned by the unexpected return of their employer with unfamiliar guests. Their polished appearances and raised brows said enough. Whispers stirred as Mia spun in awe at the chandelier above, her giggle echoing in the marble hall, as though shielding her from invisible arrows. One of the senior housekeepers, Mrs. Whitman, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, shall we prepare the guest wing?" Her tone was polite, but the implication was clear. Why were these strangers here? "We're not guests," Ethan said firmly, surprising even himself with the conviction in his tone. "They'll be staying here for the winter. Make sure they have everything they need." The murmurs grew louder. Isabella's face flushed, shame and fury colliding, but before she could speak, Ethan turned sharply toward the staff. His voice, usually reserved for boardrooms, cut through the whispers like a blade. "If anyone here has a problem with me bringing them into this house," he said, his gaze sweeping the room, "you can collect your final paycheck tomorrow. Do I make myself clear?" The hall fell silent. For the first time in years, his words weren't about profit margins or market shares, they were about protection. Isabella stared at him, stunned into silence. Mia only beamed, clutching his hand tighter. That night, the sisters were shown to a cozy suite in the East Wing. It was simple compared to the grand rooms of the estate, but to them, it felt like another world. The walls were warm with soft golden light, the beds freshly made with thick quilts, the air faintly scented with lavender. Mia threw herself onto the bed with a squeal. "It's so soft," she cried, bouncing up and down. "Isabella, feel it?" Isabella sat gingerly on the edge, her eyes darting between the luxurious surroundings and her sister's joy. When Ethan appeared in the doorway, she straightened immediately. "This doesn't change anything," she said coolly. "We're still leaving when winter ends." Ethan nodded. "I know." His eyes softened as they flicked toward Mia, who was already half asleep, hugging her doll against the mountain of pillows. "But at least she'll be warm tonight." For a fleeting second, Isabella's eyes softened too, but then she turned away, her defenses snapping back into place. The following days brought a rhythm neither expected. Mia flourished in the open space of the estate. She ran through the gardens, decorated gingerbread cookies in the kitchen, and discovered a piano tucked away in the music room. Her laughter filled corners of the house that had long been silent. Ethan found himself pausing in doorways, watching her without being noticed. Something in her innocence stirred memories he had long buried, memories of his own childhood loneliness, of a boy waiting for a father who never came home. Isabella, however, remained wary. She kept a close watch on her sister, intercepting the slow-garning glances of staff bristling at the unspoken judgment in their eyes. And yet, she couldn't ignore what she saw in Ethan. He wasn't just tolerating Mia's presence, he was engaging with her. He helped her build a snowman in the garden, listened intently when she babbled about her doll, and once, when she stumbled, he knelt in the snow without hesitation to brush away her tears. Still, his controlling habits bled through. He tried to set strict schedules, insisting Mia eat at certain times, that Isabella allow staff to handle chores, that every activity be neatly organized. Isabella finally snapped one evening when she found him dictating a rigid timetable for Mia's meals and playtime. "She's not one of your employees," Isabella said sharply, snatching the paper from his hand. "She's a child. She doesn't need a schedule. She needs—" Ethan bristled. "Structure gives stability." Structure might build companies, Isabella shot back, but love builds children. For a long moment they stood locked in silence, their gazes clashing, and then Ethan, to his own surprise, backed down. He crumpled the paper in his hand and tossed it aside. That night, as he watched Mia fall asleep curled against her sister, he realized Isabella was right, and for the first time, he wondered if the walls he had built around his life weren't protecting him at all, but suffocating him. The gossip in the mansion did not die down easily. Despite Ethan's warning, whispers lingered in corridors, spreading like wildfire among the staff. Isabella could feel eyes on her whenever she passed, measuring, judging. She held her head high, but the sting of their assumptions gnawed at her pride. One afternoon, she overheard two maids muttering in the laundry room. "Did you see her shoes? Falling apart. Why would Mr. Cole bring people like that here? Probably some arrangement. Men like him don't do things for free." Isabella froze, her blood rushing hot through her veins. She nearly stormed in to confront them, but before she could, Ethan's voice cut across the room. "Enough." The maids fell silent, their faces blanching as Ethan stepped into view. His expression was cold, his tone sharper than Isabella had ever heard outside a boardroom. "If I hear another word like that, you're gone. I don't care how long you've worked here. Do not mistake kindness for weakness, and do not disrespect the people I allow in my home." The maid stammered apologies and scurried away. Ethan turned, his gaze softening as it fell on Isabella. "You didn't have to do that," she muttered, though her voice wavered. "Yes, I did," Ethan replied quietly. For a moment, Isabella saw past the polished CEO exterior. She glimpsed the boy who had once known abandonment, the man who perhaps carried his own invisible scars. Dia, oblivious to the undercurrents, flourished. She skipped through the halls, drew pictures at the kitchen table, and declared one morning that she wanted to decorate a Christmas tree. Ethan surprised even himself by agreeing. That evening, the three of them stood in the grand living room, surrounded by boxes of ornaments. Mia hummed as she placed baubles on the lower branches, while Isabella strung lights higher up. Ethan, unused to such domestic rituals, awkwardly hung a golden star before Isabella laughed softly and adjusted it. The sound startled him, not mocking, but genuine, light, warm. It had been years since laughter like that had filled his home. Later, as they sat by the glowing tree, Mia dozed on Isabella's lap, her doll cradled in her arms. Ethan watched them silently, something inside him loosening. His mansion, usually pristine and silent, now felt alive. Isabella caught him staring. "What?" she asked, her tone defensive but quieter than usual. "Nothing," he said after a pause. "Just thank you for bringing life back into this house." Her eyes softened for a heartbeat before she looked away. Over the next weeks, their uneasy truce deepened. Isabella challenged Ethan constantly, questioning his rigid rules, pushing back against his instinct to control, demanding he see Mia as more than a problem to be managed. And Ethan, against all odds, found himself listening. When Mia begged to stay up past her bedtime to finish coloring, Ethan started to refuse, but Isabella's raised brow made him pause. Instead, he relented, watching as Mia's little hands carefully filled in the page. When he suggested hiring a tutor for Mia, Isabella insisted she needed play and stories more than structured lessons. Ethan scoffed, but later that night, he saw Mia curled up in Isabella's arms, laughing at a silly story. He couldn't deny her. Slowly, painfully, Ethan realized that control could not replace love. And Isabella, stood-born, fiery, unyielding, was teaching him that lesson without even trying. The snow outside the estate fell heavy that evening, muffling the world in silence. Inside, the fire crackled in the great hearth, casting a golden glow across the library. Ethan stood near the shelves, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand, while Isabella sat stiffly across from him, her arms folded protectively over her chest. The tension between them had been growing for days. Every lingering glance, every clash of values, every unspoken truth weighing heavier with each moment. Tonight, it could no longer be ignored. "You keep looking at Mia like she's a mirror," Isabella said suddenly, her voice sharp but low, like she's stirring something in you you'd rather keep buried. What is it you see when you look at her, Ethan? Ethan's jaw tightened. He had built empires by controlling narratives, by never letting emotions dictate decisions. But Isabella's steady gaze pierced him in a way no rival, no boardroom, ever had. He turned to the window, snowflakes blurring against the glass. "Mother," he said finally, the words almost choking him. "I see. My mother." Isabella blinked, startled. "Your mother?" He exhaled slowly, setting the glass down with a soft thud. "She left when I was 8. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. She ran off with someone else, left me with nothing but a suitcase and a note I couldn't read at the time. I went from one foster home to another, never staying long enough to belong anywhere." For a moment, the confident CEO facade slipped. His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "I know what it feels like to be the child left behind. No matter how many millions I made, no matter how many boardrooms I conquered, that shadow never left me. Success doesn't erase the truth. You carry the brand of being unwanted." Isabella's expression softened despite herself. She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her tone quieter now. "Ethan." He shook his head, cutting her off before she could offer pity. "It wasn't until my uncle took me in that I even had a chance. He gave me structure, education, a name to stand on. But it came with chains too, expectations, a life built on proving I was worth the roof over my head." His eyes flicked to hers, hard and haunted. "You see, Isabella, I know what it costs a child to feel disposable, and I won't let Mia pay that price." Isabella looked down at her hands, her throat tightening. "You think I don't know what that's like?" she murmured. Her words made him pause. He watched her as she swallowed hard, her voice shaking as she spoke. Her momently. "Heat was being watered down. Heat was being broken. I was 21, working nights at a diner, studying when I could, barely keeping the lights on. The state tried to take her from me more than once. Said I wasn't fit. Said I didn't have enough. Do you know what it's like to sleep in shifts just to make sure your little sister isn't taken while you work?" Her voice broke, tears spilling despite her best efforts. More than once, and every day, a fight to prove I'm enough for her. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, with shared scars neither had expected to lay bare. Ethan moved closer, his hand twitching as if to reach for hers but stopping short. "You've done more than enough," he said softly. "You kept her alive, you kept her safe, but Isabella?" He hesitated, his next words deliberate. "Safety isn't always enough. What if I adopted her, formally? That way no one could ever take her away again. Not the state, not poverty, not anyone." For a moment, Isabella stared at him, uncomprehending. Then her face hardened, color rushing to her cheeks. She shot to her feet. "Adopt her?" she snapped. "You think this is something you can buy? Like a company? Like an acquisition?" Ethan flinched at her tone, but didn't back down. "It's not about money, it's about security. She would never have to fear losing her home again." "She has a home." Isabella's voice thundered through the library. "She has me. I am her family, Ethan. I have bled for her, starved for her, fought for her. And now you want to step in with your money and your power and sign a paper that says she belongs to you? No, absolutely not." Ethan's chest heaved, frustration brimming. "That's not what I meant. I'm not trying to take her from you. I'm trying to give her everything I never had." "You're trying to erase me," Isabella countered, her voice breaking, "and you don't even see it." The room quaked with silence after her words. Ethan stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. Isabella turned away, wiping her tears furiously. From down the hall came the faint sound of Mia's laughter as she played with one of the maids. That innocent sound only deepened the chasm yawning between them. For the first time since they'd met, Ethan and Isabella felt not like allies in survival, but enemies drawn apart by ghosts neither could escape. The days that followed were steeped in a cold tension. Mia thrived in the estate, her cheeks flushed from sledding in the gardens, her voice bright as she sang carols with the staff, who had grown to adore her. But between Ethan and Isabella, an icy distance stretched wider with each passing hour. Ethan buried himself in work, taking calls in his office late into the night, the glow of his laptop reflecting the storm in his eyes. Isabella kept to the East Wing, reading bedtime stories to Mia and avoiding meals in the grand dining hall. Their paths crossed only briefly, and when they did, silence spoke louder than words. But neither could escape the weight of their last fight. Isabella replayed Ethan's words, "Adopt her," like a blade in her chest. Did he truly believe money and paperwork could overwrite years of sacrifice? That her love could be bought? Ethan, meanwhile, heard the echo of her accusation. "You're trying to erase me?" and wondered if he had crossed the very line he had sworn not to. He had wanted to protect Mia from abandonment, but in doing so, had he made Isabella feel abandoned herself? One evening, unable to bear the suffocating quiet, Isabella found herself wandering into the library again. She didn't expect Ethan to be there, but she was, sitting in the dark, staring into the fireplace. "I thought you'd be buried in your empire," she said, her voice brittle. He looked up, his face shadowed by the flames. "And I thought you'd be avoiding me." She crossed her arms, standing by the door. "I have been—" They stared at each other, the silence crackling. Finally, Ethan set down his glass, his voice lower this time, almost pleading. "I'm sorry," he said. The words seemed foreign in his mouth, reluctant but real. "I didn't mean to diminish what you've done for Mia. I know she wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. I thought if I could make it official, then maybe she'd never feel what I felt." Isabella's breath hitched. For a fleeting moment, she saw not the ruthless CEO, but the boy he had been, standing alone with a suitcase too big for his small hands. She sank into the chair, opposite him, her voice quieter now. "You can't erase the past with contracts, Ethan. You can't erase the pain of being unwanted by stamping a last name on a piece of paper. What Mia needs isn't a savior. She needs to know the people she loved won't walk away. That's it. That's all she's ever needed." His throat tightened. "And what about you? What about me? Who makes sure you don't break from carrying all that weight alone?" Her eyes glistened, but she shook her head fiercely. "I don't have the luxury of breaking. I never did." Their gazes locked, and for one charged moment, walls crumbled. But then Mia's sleepy voice drifted from the hall. "Isabella?" And the spell broke. Isabella rose quickly, brushing past Ethan. "I should go." As she disappeared, Ethan sat back, running a hand over his face. The ghosts of his past had clawed their way back into the present, and for the first time in years, he didn't know how to fight them. And though bitterness lingered, one truth was undeniable. Mia's laughter still filled the halls, a fragile bridge between two wounded souls who didn't yet know how to meet in the middle. The morning paper arrived at the estate earlier than usual. Isabella barely noticed it at first. She was too busy tying Mia's hair into two uneven braids, while the little girl giggled at her crooked reflection in the mirror. But when one of the maids gasped audibly in the hallway, Isabella's heart sank. She reached for the newspaper, hands trembling before her eyes even scanned the page. There it was, splashed across the front. "Millionaire CEO seen with orphan girl and her sister. New romance or gold-digging scheme." The photos were grainy but cruelly intimate. One showed Ethan stepping out of his car with Mia clinging to his hand. Another caught Isabella and Mia entering the estate through the back gate, as if sneaking in. Her face flushed hot with humiliation. She had lived through whispers before, in the shelters, in the jobs where she scrubbed floors for scraps of respect. But this was different. This was her sister's name, her dignity, being dragged into tabloids that didn't care about truth, only scandal. She shoved the paper aside and forced a smile for Mia. "Finish your cereal, sweetheart. We might be going somewhere today." But her voice cracked at the edges. Downstairs, Ethan sat at the head of the dining table, the papers spread open in front of him. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white against the porcelain coffee cup he hadn't touched. His assistant, Robert, hovered nearby, phone buzzing with endless calls. "This is bad," Robert said, lowering his voice. "The board is already on edge after the last merger. Now they think you've gone soft? Worse? Reckless? They're worried this will spook investors." Ethan's gaze was locked on the photograph. Isabella's figure blurred in black and white, Mia's small hand in hers. Something twisted in his chest. Anger, guilt, protectiveness, all knotted together. "Children," Ethan muttered, his voice cold with restrained fury. "She's raising a child, and they dare spin this like some cheap scandal." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "That's how the world sees it, and unless you address it, it will define you. The board is demanding a statement. Distance yourself, immediately." The words cut like ice. Distance yourself. That was always the answer in his world. Protect the empire, cut ties, bury the damage. But for the first time, Ethan couldn't bring himself to follow the formula. Upstairs, Isabella was already packing. She moved mechanically, stuffing clothes into a worn duffel bag, folding Mia's ragged pajamas with hands that shook. Mia sat on the bed, confused, clutching her doll tightly. "Are we going on a trip?" Mia asked, her voice bright, hopeful. Isabella forced a smile. "Something like that, sweetheart." Her mind was racing. She couldn't stay here, not when her sister's face was being mocked on breakfast tables across the city. Not when whispers painted her as someone who had traded her dignity for the comfort of a millionaire's roof. She had fought too long to protect Mia from shame. She wouldn't let Ethan's world undo everything. When Ethan finally climbed the stairs, the sight of the duffel bag made his chest tighten. "Isabella," he said sharply. She spun around, eyes blazing. Don't you dare try to explain this away. You knew this could happen. You knew bringing us here would put us under a microscope." She held up the paper with shaking hands. "Do you know what it feels like to see yourself reduced to a headline like this? To see your little sister turned into someone's—" Ethan's lips pressed into a hard line. "It's noise, lies. It doesn't matter. It matters to me." Her voice cracked, raw with fury. "I have spent years clawing for scraps of dignity, Ethan. Scrubbing toilets, waiting tables, working myself sick, just to keep Mia's head above water. And now, after everything, this is what the world thinks of me. A parricide, a gold digger, a scandal. I won't stay here and let her grow up believing that's who I am." Mia looked between them with wide, frightened eyes. "Isabella?" she whispered. Isabella knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her sister's face. "It's okay, baby. We're going to be okay. We just can't stay here anymore." Ethan's chest constricted. He wanted to argue, to beg her to reconsider, but Robert's words echoed in his head. The board, the investors, the empire at risk. He hesitated. And Isabella saw it. Her eyes hardened as if a final wall had slammed into place. "That's it, isn't it? You don't know which side to choose, your board or us. And I already know which one wins." She zipped the duffel with finality. Ethan reached for her arm. "Isabella, wait, please." But she pulled free, her voice a low whisper that sliced deeper than any shout. "You'll never understand. You think love is something you can balance against profits, but for us, love is survival, and you can't buy it. Not for me, not for Mia." She turned, taking Mia's hand. Together they walked past him, Mia's small footsteps echoing against the marble floors. Ethan stood frozen in the hallway, the paper still clutched in his hand, his empire heavy on his shoulders, but his house suddenly emptier than it had ever been. The door closed softly behind them, and with it the fragile warmth that had begun to thaw his heart. The days that followed were hollow. The mansion, once filled with Mia's laughter and Isabella's quiet presence, was now suffocating in its silence. Ethan moved through the halls like a ghost, every polished surface reflecting the emptiness he had hesitated into. His board applauded his silence. Meetings resumed, stock prices stabilized. On paper, Ethan Cole was untouchable again. But the man behind the name had never felt weaker. Every night, he found himself wandering into the guest wing, where Isabella and Mia had stayed. The bed was neatly made, the wardrobe empty, but small remnants remained. A crayon drawing taped to the mirror, a hair ribbon under the pillow, the faint scent of lavender from Isabella's. He would sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the crayon drawing of a crooked house with 3 stick figures holding hands. Beneath it, Mia had scrawled her name in uneven letters, and though she hadn't written his, the third figure bore his unescapable outline. It gutted him. Robert found him there one evening and hesitated before speaking. "Sir, the merger is nearly complete. The board is pleased with your discretion. You've weathered the scandal." Ethan's laugh was hollow. "Weathered it? At what cost, Robert? They think I've won, but all I've done is lose." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "You did what was necessary for the company." Ethan turned, his eyes sharp, tired. "Then maybe the company was never worth it." That night, he poured himself a drink but couldn't bring himself to swallow it. Instead, he sat by the fire, the flames dancing in his haunted gaze. His mind replayed Isabella's last words, "For us, love is survival, and you can't buy it." He had built his empire on the idea that everything had a price, that loyalty, security, even affection could be bought if you had enough zeros in the bank. But Isabella had shattered that illusion. She hadn't wanted his money, she wanted his courage. And he had failed her. Meanwhile, across town, Isabella and Mia settled back into their cramped shelter room. It was barely heated, the single window drafty, but it was theirs. Isabella tucked Mia into bed, pulling the thin blanket over her small frame. "Where we go back, Isabella?" Mia asked softly, clutching her doll. Isabella brushed her sister's curls back tenderly. "No, sweetheart, we're safe here. That world isn't for us." But when Mia turned away, silent tears soaking her pillow, Isabella's heart splintered. Mia missed the estate, the warmth, the food, the safety. More than that, she missed Ethan. Isabella couldn't deny it. Despite the pain, Ethan had meant something to her sister. Maybe even to her. Back at the mansion, Ethan's nights grew longer. He stopped attending dinners, canceled meetings, and ignored Robert's calls. One evening, while staring at Mia's drawing again, he whispered into the empty room, "I should have fought for you, both of you." The empire no longer seemed like enough. The breaking point had come and gone, and Ethan realized too late that the cost of hesitation wasn't just a lost deal. It was losing the only family he had begun to believe he could have. It began with a shaky phone camera and a clip no longer than a minute. A bystander waiting for a midnight bus weeks earlier had noticed a little girl curled on a bench, clutching a ragged doll against the freezing December air. The stranger had lifted their phone, filming quietly as the girl whispered words no one was meant to hear. "Someone will take me home." Her voice cracked with the brittle sound of hunger and hope colliding. The doll, patched with stitches, became her only audience. The video hit the internet without warning. At first, it circulated among small advocacy pages, then snowballed as influencers, journalists, and celebrities shared it. Within hours, it was everywhere, broadcast on morning shows, replayed in boardrooms, whispered about in... The comments poured in by the thousands. "This breaks my heart. Where was everyone that night? But we cannot allow children to suffer like this." And then someone recognized her. The little girl was Mia, the same child seen in photographs leaving Ethan Cole's estate with her sister, Isabella. The narrative flipped overnight. The cruel gossip of gold digging was drowned out by a tidal wave of outrage and compassion. They worry about the future so much that they often spring her caretaker. Family deserve protection, not persecution. Where's the billionaire in all of this? Why isn't he speaking up? By morning, Ethan's office was drowning in press requests. Dozens of news crews camped outside his gates, microphones thrust through the iron fence. His board demanded he controlled the narrative, but, for once, Ethan ignored them. Instead, he sat alone in his study, the video replaying endlessly on his laptop. There was Mia, so small and fragile, whispering to her doll. He felt the words tear into him like glass. "Someday someone will take me home." His hand trembled as he paused the clip, his reflection faint in the dark screen. He remembered the night, how he had walked away, leaving her with cash, as if that could erase the hunger in her eyes. Shame scorched through him. He had built empires, commanded respect in boardrooms, broken rivals with the flick of a pen. But a little girl's plea had undone him, more than any failure ever could. He stood abruptly. The time for silence was over. Within hours, Ethan scheduled a press conference. His advisors begged him to prepare talking points, to manage the spin, to distance himself from the sisters. He pushed the papers aside, his voice hard. "No, this time I speak for myself." That evening, under the blinding glare of cameras, Ethan Cole stepped up to a podium. The world expected polished excuses, a controlled performance, perhaps even a carefully orchestrated denial. But what they heard instead was a man's voice, stripped bare of his usual armor. "I saw her that night," Ethan began, his throat tight, his eyes fixed, not on the cameras but somewhere distant. Back to the cold bus stop, to the trembling girl with her doll. "I saw Mia. I walked past her. I left her there." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Reporters exchanged glances, pens pausing over paper. This wasn't what they had expected. "I thought I could walk away and tell myself I had done enough by leaving money. But I was wrong. That night has haunted me ever since. And when she whispered those words to her doll, 'Someday someone will take me home,' she wasn't just speaking to the cold air. She was speaking to all of us." The silence in the room was profound. Even the clicking cameras had stilled. "I will not walk away again," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly before it steadied. "Mia and Isabella are not a scandal. They are not a liability. They are not pawns in some boardroom game. They are family, and I will fight for them, not because of what people expect from me, but because it is what I should have done from the very beginning." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted, reporters shouting questions, flashes exploding, the internet already flooding with clips of his words. But far from the chaos, in a cramped shelter room across the city, Isabella sat frozen in front of a flickering television screen. Mia was asleep beside her, clutching her doll, unaware of the storm her whispered dream had created. Isabella's hands shook as she pressed the blanket tighter around her sister. She had braced herself for Ethan's silence, his distance, his prioritizing of power over truth. But what she saw was different. He hadn't hidden, he hadn't spun a story. He had confessed to the world and to himself. And that vulnerability pierced through the anger she had built like armor around her heart. The days that followed were unlike anything Isabella had imagined. The internet flooded with support. Hashtags trended globally. A Mia wish, no child in existence. Strangers from every corner of the world shared their own stories of abandonment, of finding hope in unexpected places. Donations poured into shelters. Advocacy groups seized the momentum, demanding systemic change for children like Mia. For the first time in years, Isabella felt the tide turning, not against them, but for them. Yet she kept her guard up, unwilling to believe in hope too easily. Meanwhile, Ethan's empire trembled, but did not fall. His board raged, investors panicked, and rivals whispered that he had lost his edge. But none of it mattered. For once, Ethan didn't flinch. He canceled meetings, ignored warnings, and poured his energy into something greater. He visited shelters, spoke to volunteers, even sat with children who reminded him of his own scarred past. He was no longer just a CEO commanding balance sheets. He was a man trying to repair something in himself through every act of compassion. And slowly, Isabella began to see the change. One evening, she stepped outside the shelter to find a small package waiting. Inside was a handwritten note from Ethan, the words shaky but earnest. "You were right. Love cannot be bought, but it can be chosen. And I choose you, both of you. I will not stop proving it." Beside the note lay a simple gift. A new doll, for Mia, not pristine or flashy, but stitched with the same crooked smile as her old one. Attached was a tag, for when the old one gets tired. Every doll deserves a friend. Isabella's throat tightened. It wasn't wealth he was offering, it was thoughtfulness, it was care. But still, she hesitated. She had carried her sister alone for too long to trust so quickly. And yet, that night, as she tucked Mia into bed, with both dolls at her side, she realized the walls around her heart were not as unbreakable as they once were. Across the city, Ethan sat in his empty mansion, staring at his phone. The press conference had unleashed storms, praise, criticism, speculation. But none of it mattered. Only one thing mattered: whether Isabella believed him. And though she hadn't answered his calls, though the distance between them remained, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years. Hope? Because for the first time, he hadn't tried to control the narrative. He hadn't hidden behind his fortune. He had spoken from the broken place inside him that longed to be healed. And maybe, just maybe, Isabella had heard him. The viral truth had changed the world's perception, but for Ethan, the greater battle was still ahead, proving to Isabella and Mia that his words were not just a public declaration, but a promise he intended to keep. The storm had rolled in with no mercy. Sheets of rain poured from the blackened sky, hammering against the pavement, turning streets into rivers of reflection. Thunder cracked above the city, echoing against the old brick walls of the shelter where Isabella had finally tucked Mia into bed. The shelter was dimly lit, buzzing faintly with the sound of leaking pipes and murmured conversations. Isabella sat by the window, her arms crossed tightly as she stared at the storm outside. Her chest ached with exhaustion, the kind that went beyond the body and sank into the soul. She had fought too long for rent, for food, for Mia's safety, and now even hope felt dangerous. And then she saw him. Through the curtain of rain, a tall figure moved toward the shelter doors. His expensive suit was drenched, his polished shoes splashing through puddles like any other desperate man. Ethan Cole, the man whose name filled headlines and commanded entire industries, was now staggering through the downpour, carrying no umbrella, no guards, nothing but his own trembling resolve. Her heart seized. Part of her wanted to bolt the door, to keep him out, to shield Mia from the chaos he always brought, but part of her couldn't look away. Ethan reached the steps and stumbled, water dripping from his hair as he finally collapsed to his knees in the rain. He looked up at her, eyes raw, stripped of pride. "Isabella," he shouted through the storm, his voice breaking against the thunder. "Please, just listen." Isabella froze in the doorway, her hand braced against the frame. "Go home, Ethan. This isn't your world." But he didn't move. Instead, he lowered his head, the weight of his confession pressing him down. "I can't go home. Not without you. Not without Mia." Her breath caught, anger colliding with something far more dangerous, the faint spark of longing. She stepped forward, rain soaking her thin sweater, her voice sharp. "You think you can kneel here and undo everything? You nearly let your world destroy us, Ethan. You almost proved every wish." The words cut him, but he didn't flinch. His eyes lifted, dark but steady. "I don't want to take her from you, Isabella. I don't want to own her or control you. I want to be part of you. Both of you. Please believe that." Her hands trembled. The walls she had built over years of survival screamed at her to turn away. But then, from behind her, a small voice broke through the storm. "Please, Isa." Isabella turned. Mia stood barefoot in the sheltered doorway, her ragged doll clutched tight against her chest. Her curls stuck to her forehead, and her eyes, so wide, so trusting, looked between her sister and Ethan. "I want him." The shelter went still. The words were not loud, but they echoed like a bell. Isabella's throat burned. She wanted to protect Mia from hurt, from disappointment, from the same pain she herself had endured. And yet, how could she deny the truth shining in her sister's eyes? Mia had found something in Ethan she had been searching for all her short life. A father's presence, a promise of home. Ethan's voice cracked as he reached forward, though the rain still lashed against him. "I don't want to save you, Isabella. I want to belong with you. With both of you. For once in my life, I don't want to run or hide behind money or pretend I can fix everything with power. I want to be yours, if you'll let me." The storm raged on, but Isabella's defenses faltered. She saw not the billionaire in headlines, not the man who had hurt her pride, but someone stripped bare, begging for a place in the very family he had once been too blind to see. Tears blurred her vision. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Do you know what you're asking, Ethan? To walk into a life you can't control? To love us, not as trophies, not as possessions, but as equals. Can you really do that?" For the first time, he didn't respond with promises of power or vows of protection. He simply bowed his head, water streaming down his face like penance. "I can try, and if I fail, I will rise again and keep trying until I am worthy of you." The rain seemed to soften then, its furious rhythm quieting to a steady song. Isabella's chest heaved, her will breaking under the weight of love she had tried so long to bury. Slowly, she reached out a trembling hand. Ethan's fingers closed around hers, firm yet gentle, grounding her in a way that words never could. And in that storm, beneath the judgment of the city and the ghosts of their pasts, Isabella finally let herself believe. Not in wealth, not in promises, but in the raw, undeniable truth of love. The shelter door opened wider as Isabella stepped into the rain, pulling Mia close with one arm and gripping Ethan's hand with the other. For a long moment, the three of them simply stood together, drenched and trembling, but bound by something far stronger than the storm. Inside the shelter, curious eyes peered out, volunteers whispered, unsure whether to intervene. But when they saw Ethan kneeling, with a child clinging to his arm, and Isabella's tears shining in the dim light, no one moved. They knew they were witnessing something too sacred to interrupt. Ethan rose slowly, his hand still locked in Isabella's. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual command. "I can't erase the nights you cried alone, or the times I failed to stand beside you. But I can give you now. I can give you tomorrow, and I will not walk away." Isabella searched his face, looking for cracks, for deception. But all she found was truth. Painful, imperfect truth, but truth nonetheless. Mia tugged at her sleeve, whispering into the hush of the storm, "Can we go home now, Isa, all of us?" The question shattered what was left of Isabella's resistance. Home. It wasn't a mansion or a shelter, not walls or roofs. It was the place where hearts dared to belong. And Mia had already decided. Ethan was part of that place. Isabella's tears spilled freely, mingling with the rain. She cupped Ethan's face, her voice breaking. "All right, we'll try. Not for money, not for safety, but for love. That's all I ever wanted for Mia, for us." Ethan closed his eyes, relief crashing over him like the storm itself. He pressed his forehead against hers, whispering through the rain, "Thank you, for giving me a chance I don't deserve, but one I'll spend my life earning." The moment sealed itself in the storm's embrace. For the first time in years, Ethan's mansion would not feel empty. For the first time, Isabella's burden would not rest on her shoulders alone. And for the first time, Mia's whispered dream had come true. Someone had taken her home. When they finally stepped back into the shelter, soaked but smiling through tears, the volunteers quietly cheered. They didn't know the whole story, but they saw enough. A family being born out of brokenness, stitched together by love rather than wealth. Despite that, as Ethan tucked Mia into a borrowed cot, and Isabella leaned against the doorway, she watched him carefully place the ragged doll beside her sister's pillow. He bent low, his voice soft. "Sleep well, little one. You'll never be alone again." Isabella's heart clenched. For the first time, she believed him. Outside, the storm faded into silence, leaving behind streets washed clean by the rain. And in that fragile, holy quiet, a new beginning had been written. Not in contracts, not in wealth, but in love that had finally found its voice. 1 year later, the Cole estate no longer echoed with silence. Where once the marble halls had felt like a mausoleum of Ethan's wealth, they now thrummed with warmth, laughter spilling from the kitchen, music drifting from the study, the pitter-patter of small footsteps dancing across the floor. Ethan Cole, the man who once buried himself in balance sheets and quarterly gains, now found himself measuring life by different numbers. Mia's giggles, Isabella's soft smiles, the steady rhythm of family meals shared around a long wooden table that no longer felt empty. The journey had not been perfect. There had been clashes over trust, over fears, over the wounds of the past that could not be erased with vows or rings. But every fight had ended with something Ethan once thought impossible: compromise. For the first time, he wasn't trying to control outcomes. He was learning to belong. He and Isabella were married now, though the wedding had been nothing like society expected from a CEO. No sprawling ballroom, no champagne towers. Instead, it had been held in the very shelter where Ethan had first knelt in the rain, begging her forgiveness. Volunteers who had once watched silently now clapped as Isabella walked down the aisle with Mia as her flower girl. The vows were simple, but they carried more weight than any contract Ethan had ever signed. To save, Ethan had whispered, holding Isabella's trembling hands, but to belong. And Isabella, her voice breaking, had answered, not to be rescued, but to be loved. That promise had carried them into the new life they were now building together. The Cole mansion had been transformed. A portion of its unused wings had been repurposed into transitional apartments for families leaving homelessness. Isabella's idea. She had insisted that they couldn't just throw money at shelters across the city while living in empty luxury. If they had space, it had to be used. Ethan resisted at first. His pride bristled at the thought of strangers under his roof, but Isabella's conviction never wavered. Eventually, he relented, and when he saw children laughing in rooms that once gathered dust, something in him shifted permanently. It was from that vision that the Homeward Foundation was born. Together, Ethan and Isabella launched it with a mission to provide housing, education, and counseling for homeless children and their families. Ethan provided the funding, but Isabella led the heart. She refused to let it become a faithless charity. Every program had names and stories attached, every decision filtered through the lens of dignity. And Mia, the little girl once found shivering at a bus stop, became their unexpected ambassador. Her smile graced the foundation's brochures, not as a symbol of pity, but of possibility. On this particular afternoon, the foundation was hosting its first major event, a community fair at a renovated downtown park, open not to donors in tuxedos, but to the very families they sought to serve. Food stalls lined the walkways, children played on newly built swings, and laughter blended with the live music drifting from a local bandstand. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, his arm loosely draped around Isabella's waist as he watched Mia dart between booths, her hair flying, her doll tucked safely in her arm despite its ragged edges. For all his billions, nothing he owned compared to the sight of her joy. Isabella leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice quiet beneath the noise. "You've changed more than this mansion, Ethan. You've changed yourself." He swallowed hard, his gaze locked on Mia's skipping figure. "No," he whispered. "You both changed me. I only followed where you led." It was then that a boy, no older than Mia, approached her. His clothes were worn, his eyes carrying the weight of hunger and nights spent on sidewalks. But there was curiosity in his voice as he asked softly, "Do you still remember the bus stop?" The question froze time. For a moment, Ethan's chest ached, remembering the cold night he had nearly walked away forever. But Mia didn't flinch. She smiled, her small hand slipping into Ethan's on one side and Isabella's on the other. "Remember," she said, her voice bright but steady. "But I don't live there anymore." Tears burned Ethan's eyes before he could stop them. The little girl who once whispered dreams to a ragged doll was now strong enough to tell her story aloud. He bent his head, pressing a kiss against her hair, his voice breaking as he whispered words he had rehearsed in his heart 1,000 times. He said, so only they could hear, "This is the legacy I want to leave behind. Not the company, not the wealth, just this. Us." Isabella's hand tightened around his. She knew, better than anyone, how far he had come, from the cold CEO who once believed money was the only shield, to the man now standing with tears in his eyes at a community fair, unashamed of love. And for the first time, Ethan believed it too. The fair stretched into evening, lanterns glowing as families gathered for a closing ceremony. Volunteers handed out hot chocolate, children huddled with new coats provided by the foundation, and a sense of belonging wrapped the park like a second layer of warmth. Ethan stood on the stage with Isabella and Mia by his side. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, but for once, he didn't care about the optics. He cared only about telling the truth. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying through the speakers, steadier than he felt. "A year ago, I walked past a bus stop and saw a little girl asleep on a bench. I nearly kept walking. But something stopped me. That night changed my life, because that little girl wasn't just a stranger, she became my daughter." The crowd murmured, emotion rippling through them. Isabella squeezed his hand, her eyes shimmering with pride. Ethan continued. I built empires, but they were empty. I gathered wealth, but it never gave me peace. It took a child with a ragged doll and a woman brave enough to challenge me, to show me what mattered. Today, I stand before you, not as a CEO, but as a husband, a father, and a man who finally understands that belonging is the greatest fortune of all. Applause thundered through the park. Some wept openly, others simply nodded, as if Ethan's words had reached into their own unspoken wounds. Mia tugged his sleeve, and Ethan bent low. Can I say something too? She whispered. He smiled and handed her the microphone, his heart swelling as she stood on tiptoe to reach it. Her small voice rang out clear. I used to live at a bus stop. I was scared and cold, but now I have a home, and I want every kid to have one too. The silence that followed was broken by a wave of applause louder than before. Reporters scribbled furiously, but Ethan didn't need their headlines. He knew the truth. Mia's words had already done more than any speech of his ever could. As the crowd dispersed, families lingering with newfound hope, Ethan stood with Isabella and Mia beneath the lanterns. For the first time in years, he felt no burden, no hollow ambition, just peace. Isabella leaned close, whispering, You kept your promise, Ethan. You belong. He closed his eyes, letting the truth settle. For years, he had thought legacy was something etched in skyscrapers and stock tickers. But tonight, he understood. Legacy wasn't wealth, it was belonging. It was the memory of a bus stop transformed into the promise of a home. And as he held Isabella's hand in one and Mia's in the other, Ethan Cole knew he had finally found his